Okay, looks like we are live. This is a special edition of the Brothers Wisp. Andrew Thrift has got some information on MikroTik switches and chips, and we'll talk about the new switch config that's been re-released in 6.41 RC something. So I guess since Thrift is the one that has all the information, we'll turn the show over to him, and we'll just shut up unless we have questions.
Feel free to button with questions. Hey guys, so MikroTik have recently released 2 new products onto the market, which are the CRS326, which is a 24-port gigabit switch with dual gigabit uplink. Also, I think shares the same architecture with the CSS326, but that's a web managed version. And they've also released a shiny new one, which is the CRS317. That's a 16 times SFP plus, so 16 10 gig ports with a single copper gigabit uplink as well. They've also announced a couple of other products which are not yet on the market. One of those is the CRS328-24P. That's similar to the 326, apart from it seems to use a different chipset, and it's got 24 copper ports with PoE output, and it appears that that can be active or passive or however you want to configure it. But what's common across all of these new switches, and is different from all of the other MikroTik switches, is that they use a new chipset for MikroTik, which is from Marvell. It's called the Prestera, and the particular designation is the Prestera DX. Now, these are, I guess, a pretty mainstream switching chipset, so similar to your Broadcom Tridents and Tomahawks and that sort of thing. They're kind of targeted at the well, at almost every space that you'd expect switches to be in. So the SMB space, Metro Ethernet, and Enterprise Edge as well. Those are their main kind of use cases. So the features in them are pretty extensive. It'll be interesting to see what MikroTik are going to implement. But so far they've released a couple of firmware router OS versions that support the new hardware. The current feature sets pretty minimal, and a couple of the guys here have had experience with it, and we'll probably talk about that a bit more later on. But we'll talk about the hardware now. So I mentioned the 2 models that are out so far. Each of those has the same Prestera DX CPU. Effectively, the CRS326 is 24 ports of copper. It has a single core ARM 800 MHz processor. So again, we're seeing some more products from MikroTik with the ARM architecture here. Seems to be a bit of a growing trend. It's got 2 SFP plus cages and I think it's a single power supply. Is that right, guys?
It looks like a possible single power supply.
I think it's a DC input as well on that one. It's only got a 24-watt power draw, so pretty low power. The 317, as we talked about before, it has a much more powerful spec because it's a 10 gig switch. It's got a dual core ARM 800 MHz processor, and it's got a full gig of RAM. It also has dual AC power supplies and about twice the power draw. It's about 42 watts. And the other cool thing about this switch is that it has passive cooling. So it's like the CCR 1009. It's got a large heatsink on the back with a heat pipe. And something else that MikroTik have added into this one is it has dual fans in it. But from what the guys at MikroTik have said so far, it stays completely passive until the unit starts overheating. And when it starts overheating, the fans will come in and start spinning at that point. So the fans are effectively sitting there doing nothing until there's a problem, in which case it can force the unit to cool down. And I thought that was pretty cool. The other unit, which has been announced but is not shipping yet, the PoE version of that CRS328, it again has the dual core ARM processor and 24 gigabit ports with 802.3 AF and AT output. And it has 4 SFP plus ports as well, so it's got 40 gig worth of uplink. And it also looks like it has a single power supply in it, but it's AC, so that'll make it nice and easy. And I noticed a few other things on the front panel, like it's got LEDs for 24 volts or 48. So I'm not sure if that means that switch can only output 24 or it can only output 48. It's pretty unclear at this point in time. But I guess in one of the upcoming mums or newsletters, we'll find out a bit more about that. But I'm pretty excited about that one. It'll be interesting to see what it can actually do. Yeah. So what's different about the new Marvell DX chipsets compared to what Microtek have previously used? So Microtek were previously using one of Qualcomm Atheros's switch chips. Not sure of its exact designation. There's a whole bunch of them in there. But in Router OS, those switch chips had a fairly complicated configuration. I'm sure if you've ever tried doing any VLAN filtering on them, you'll be quite aware of how complex the configuration is. It seemed like Microtek had basically taken the API from Qualcomm and exposed almost all the settings. So while you could do anything on them, it was very hard to do that. They had a separate switch menu, which is still currently there. It had a whole bunch of the standard sort of layer 2 switch features. It's just very complicated to configure. The Marvell switch chips are similar in their base functionality, but they have a whole lot more. The particular model that Microtek are using, the DX, is a fairly full-featured chipset, and there's many variations within the Prestera DX. So the main CPUs that they're using at the moment are a little one known as the AliCat 3. That's in the CRS 326. And then that one is an SMB segment switch chip. It can do all of the standard layer 2 stuff, but not much more. However, in the bigger models, they're using ones known as what appear to be the PonCat 3 from Marvell. They've got a much better feature set. So between the two main chipsets that they've got, the big base features are that they support spanning tree and hardware. They've also got support for ring protocols like G8032v2, which other people might have seen as EAPs on other vendors. They've got hardware broadcast and unicast and multicast storm protection, which is great. That means that effectively the port is constantly listening in hardware, and when it sees the number of packets for broadcast, unicast, or multicast go over a threshold that you've set, it will start to drop those packets. So that can effectively protect the rest of your network from broadcast storms and multicast storms, or even unknown unicast storms. They also have hardware VXLAN and VPLS support in them, which is a pretty high-end feature. It effectively allows the hardware, the ASIC in the switch, to terminate a VXLAN or a VPLS tunnel, or a bunch of other ones as well, actually, NVGRE, GRE, and provider backbone bridges and hardware.
Now you're just talking about the chipset at the moment, right? So we want to make sure that, you know, we're saying that Microtek's not supporting VXLAN or anything, but the chipset has the possibility to support it.
That's right, Justin. So yeah, these chipsets, we're just going through the features that they have on paper. Microtek may or may not support these in the future, but it'd be really awesome to see some of these supported. But it's a very big mountain, and Microtek is still at the bottom as far as integrating the feature sets into their router OS. There's a whole bunch of other features that you might have seen on other switch chips, like ingress rate limits on ports and ACLs. So they can have up to 128 rules per port, it seems, which is quite an extensive amount. That can do things like rewriting VLAN headers, stripping VLAN headers, that sort of thing. The aforementioned broadcast and multicast storm protection, and stuff like stripping off spanning tree headers if you're trying to protect a Metro Ethernet network, for example. So it does have extensive support for ACLs. Also has support for hardware mirroring of individual VLANs or ports. So what that allows you to do is, if you've got a port that's set up as a mirror listening port, you can put something like Wireshark onto that port, or TCP dump, or some other tool that's going to sniff the traffic, and then you can mirror an individual VLAN off of another port to it, if you're just wanting to see what's coming in on one VLAN on a port, or you can mirror the entire port onto the other port if you're wanting to listen to everything that's coming in and out of the port. So these features are pretty useful if you're running a denial of service detection system. You can mirror everything from your uplink port onto your DDoS detection port, and then it can see what's coming in and out and action blocking on it. The other features that are in there are port isolation and security in those chipsets. So features like 802.1x, where it can block a port if a device connects into it that is not authorized. And the other big one on there is 802.3ad, which is the link aggregation control protocol. Those chips can do that in hardware, which is pretty nice, and that appears to be a feature that is not currently in Router OS, but we may see that soon from what I've been told. So it's quite a lot of features in there. The other thing that's in the chipset itself is OpenFlow 1.4 support that they list. So I'm sure that these features all require quite extensive software support on the other side from Router OS or the vendors that are using these chipsets. And I'm sure that the OpenFlow support's mainly on the software side rather than the hardware side, but it will make use of some of the other features inside that chipset. The other one that I missed off here was 802.1ad support, which is Q&Q support. So the current Qualcomm chipsets that MikroTik are using do have that. But again, it's very obscure to configure that feature. Yeah. So those are the features that the Prestera DX is capable of, the main features. It'll be very interesting to see over the coming months which of those MikroTik introduce into the CRS3 series in Router OS, and how they're implemented, e.g. how we can configure them through the CLI and through Winbox. Those features are complicated features, and a lot of the usability will come out of how MikroTik choose to implement them in the user interface. So
is there you guys probably know is there a website folks can go to and see these, so they, the people who don't know the 802.3x and all this can say, hey, this is something that the chipset supports, so I want to tell MikroTik to support this?
There definitely is, Justin. So they can go to Marvell's website, and there's a Prestera DX page. It's a little bit confusing on their website. There's a bunch of different switching chipsets, but the ones that MikroTik seem to have focused on are the Prestera DX. So they can go to Marvell's website and go to switching and then Prestera, and they'll see that. Or if you just Google it, it'll probably take you straight to where you need to be. There's a whole bunch of data sheets on there. The chipsets that MikroTik seem to be using are the 98DX3236, which is in the CRS326, and the CRS317 has the 98DX8216. So they're quite different features. It's pretty hard to tell from the data sheets exactly what they do and don't support. There's a whole bunch of Marvell marketing terms in there, like carrier span and e-bridge. I can probably tell you what those mean, though. I did do quite a bit of research on those. So carrier span is the set of features that allow carrier features on the switches, or Metro Ethernet features. So the likes of the G8032v2, so the redundant ring protocol. That's a protocol where you can have two ports on the switch, one going north, one going south, and they link into a whole bunch of other switches going north and south to form a ring. And it sends you choose a VLAN that you want to send hello packets on. It sends them out every 50 milliseconds, and if it doesn't receive probably 3 in a row, I think it is, it will fail the path over to the other direction. So with this ring protocol, it's constantly blocking one port and talking on the other, and it sends hellos out both of them. But if it doesn't receive it on the master port, it will fail over to the second port in 50 milliseconds, which is pretty quick. You can be having a voice call and you won't notice the failover on that. So that allows you to build a pretty good, cheap Metro Ethernet network. The other features included in that carrier span are all of the tunneling features that I mentioned earlier. So the VXLAN, VPLS provide a bridge backbone, and GRI and NVGRI. So those are included in carrier span. The other marketing terms that you'll see thrown around by Marvell are the E-bridge and E-router. Those are the features that allow some pretty flexible bridging. So one of the really nice things about this chipset compared to the other chipsets is the E-bridge and the E-router, but particularly the E-bridge is like it's a hardware bridge. It's in the chipset. You can add a VLAN into one side of it and a port in another, and it will just bridge that VLAN to the port on the other side. Likewise, you can put some of the carrier span features in there. So you could put a VXLAN tunnel into the E-bridge, and you could put a port on the other side into the E-bridge, and it will just bridge the two together. So Marvell have done some pretty nice work on that one. The E-router is the layer 3 features of the chipset. So some of those Marvell Prestera DXs can do layer 3 in hardware. So they just have effectively a fib or a TCAM table on the ASIC that does matching between IP addresses and ports, and effectively allows it to forward layer 3 traffic in hardware. So those are some pretty high-end features. It'll be very interesting to see what MikroTik implement.
Yeah, and then I assume that those are more, that they're not large tables, and you can't go stuffing, full table, full internet routes in them.
No, I suspect not, and that's one of the differences between the different Prestera DX chipsets. There's actually another one that they have called the Bobcat 2, and it supports external memory for the TCAM. So on that, you could probably take a full table, but that doesn't appear to be being used in any of the current MikroTik products. Between that and the other chipsets like the PonCat 2, which MikroTik, or PonCat 3, sorry, that MikroTik do appear to be using, and the AliCat 3, they don't have the support for the external memory for the TCAM. So Mike's correct. While they can do the layer 3 routing, they certainly won't be able to take a full table. It'll probably be, I'm guessing, like 20,000 or 30,000 entries in the fib at the most, just like the lower end broad chips.
Oh yeah, it's like, it'll do, for anybody listening to us, it'll do their internal network, and in some areas may do their domestic routes, but it's it's not going to do everything.
No, that's right. It's still a pretty awesome feature in there though. A lot of providers will still find it useful. I think they'll probably just have a default route and a bunch of their internal routes, so it'll certainly work for that use case. But you're not going to be running one of these as your border router anytime soon.
So MikroTik has actually had chips which have had hardware or routing layer 3 functionality in them for a while now. Also, a lot of the existing chips for I would say a couple of years now, they've been on the market in the MikroTiks, especially in the newer 9 series, the HAPS, etc. Also have hardware NAT and similar things, but so far we haven't seen MikroTik implement any of those. And this is mostly because of those limits. If you look at the existing chips, most of them have limits like 64 or 16 hardware NAT rules or 16 hardware firewall rules, etc., etc. And so those limits, those hardware chip limits, are always very, very difficult to integrate into a product like RouterOS, which allows you to do just about anything. because you usually get into trouble of, what is hardware, what is software, and how to cross integrate between those things when you hit the hard limits of the hardware chips. So it will be interesting to see if MikroTik does decide at all to implement these hardware layer 3 and up functionality or not, because historically they haven't. So we'll just have to see.
I'll say like and so with this new, switch chip, auto hardware offload thing that they're working on in the latest RCs, seems like they've gotten the stones to start trying to make that happen in some aspects. So maybe that's some hope that in the future they'll apply lessons learned for doing VLAN configs, hardware versus software, into NAT and route tables and whatever else may be hardware accelerated.
Yeah, it does look like they're heading in the right direction with that feature. For those of you who don't know, effectively on RouterOS 6.41 RC, you can now have a bridge and just add a bunch of the physical ports in the device to it, and it will work out whether they can be forwarded in hardware or software automatically. So it'll either use the switch chip that's built into the router, or if it cannot use that, it'll just bridge it in software. So they're working towards not having that differentiation in RouterOS between a switch and a bridge. They look like they're trying to merge the two, which is really promising and will make usability a lot better. The other thing I have to say on that is in the past, MikroTik have been really resistant to changing the workflow within RouterOS and the way that things work.
No one knows that better than Tom.
Yes, this is the first really big change to workflow. So instead of configuring the switch chip through that switch menu, they're heading towards being able to configure the whole thing through the bridge menu. And sometimes you do have to break that backwards compatibility and break the workflow, but when it's for the better, your users won't mind, and I certainly don't mind the way that they've changed this. So I think it's actually fantastic.
I've been looking at the data sheets for those two chips you mentioned, and to kind of bridge that with something else I've seen on their forum. A couple months back, they were saying, what would you like to see on as far as port configurations on a device that supports 100 gigabit of throughput, and there was a lot of creative suggestions, to put it lightly, but I think you and maybe one other person were saying a better way of implementing some of those suggestions was to I'm trying to think, to stack or port extend from one device to another. See that both of these chipsets support 802.1BR bridge port extension capability. Sounds like that could be used to implement that.
It does actually, Mike. So that's something I did notice early on in these new chipset feature lists or data sheets. The 802.1BR is a pretty new standard, but effectively it allows you to, as Mike said, stack switches together, where one becomes the master switch and the other switches become slaves, and they're all configured from the master switch, and it all does it dynamically. It just effectively extends the bridge into another chassis. And we've seen features like this in the past implemented by the likes of Brocade with their VDX and with Juniper on their virtual chassis. And I believe Alcatel-Lucent or Nokia actually have something very similar between their 7750 routers and 7210 access switches, which MikroTik could implement maybe if they choose to. How it works on the Nokias is kind of what I was thinking of when I mentioned that feature on the forums. With the Nokias, you can have your big expensive 7750 router that might have a bunch of 10 gig ports on it, for example, and then you can have your little service access switch downlinked from it. And the service access switch, you just configure it to be in port extender mode from the router, and it might have 24 gigabit ports on it and 2 10 gig uplinks. And all of a sudden now on your big 7750 router, you've now got an extra 24 copper ports that appear in the user interface that you can configure as router interfaces, and it just extends them down to that access switch from the router. So what that could allow MikroTik to do, for example, is they could have a CRS326 type product that can be uplinked to their new router that has a limited port configuration, or it could be uplinked to something like the CCR 1072 with 2 10 gig uplinks. And then on that router, you would then have another 24 copper ports appear as configurable ports on that device, and it will just be extended through to the switch, which I think is a pretty cool feature, but who knows? That's a bit of a pipe dream, that one. But the hardware certainly supports it. So yeah, these chipsets are pretty exciting, and the way MikroTik's heading is pretty exciting. I think it's going to be a while before we start seeing what features are going to be introduced by MikroTik into Router OS. There's a lot of thought that'll have to go into these, especially the layer 3 stuff. I think if they even implement that, we may not see it until the next major release of Router OS, whenever that may come.
I would fully expect us to, it might be a little hard because it's not the way it is now, but it'd be nice if MikroTik had a switching dash test like they had with the wireless stuff.
Yeah, the routing test, the wireless test. They've had tests for a bunch of stuff, I believe.
Yeah. The switching would be a little bit, more difficult because it's at the hardware level. Since they've made the change, it might be a little different. But maybe they could just have something with all the extended features that they could or could not add in. And I think it's going to be one of those things. They have so much to implement that like it's been said, it'll take a while for anything probably to come to any kind of production type environment, because a lot of it is kind of higher end features.
Oh, definitely. I think the way that they've done it with merging the hardware and software bridging under a single interface, that's very ambitious. I've actually not seen any other vendor do that. Programmatically, it must be pretty hard, and I've already heard from someone at MikroTik that this was one of the biggest single features as far as code goes that they've introduced in a long time, which is why they bumped it from 6.40 RC into 6.41. They needed to get 6.40 out the door for other new hardware, and this was such a big feature they didn't want to have to try and release it in such an early stage in the 6.40 release. So it was bumped to 6.41 and had a bunch of bug fixes rolled into it as well to make it a bit more usable. Yeah, very ambitious, guys.
Yeah, I see more and more in the 6. We won't get into the V7 stuff, but I think they're trying to get new stuff out there without, you have to wait on the next release or something like that. Whatever's going on with MikroTik in regards to version 7, at least somebody or some groups or people are saying, hey, we're getting new features out, whether it's a new version or not.
Yeah, and that's good to see, because for a couple of years it was maybe had 5 lines in them and nothing much seemed to be going on, but under the hood they were changing a lot. It just wasn't being put in the change logs. And I think there was quite a bit of feedback about that, and they seem to have taken it on board and obviously put full change logs, or near full, as full as they can be, change logs in there now of what they're changing and adding in every single release candidate or point release even. So that's really positive to see, and they are putting in some of the bigger features that people have been screaming about for years and years and years. Even things like fast path, I never expected to see that in the 6th release chain, but it's made it in there, and people are now using it, and it's what I'd call consider a stable feature. Every point release seems to have some fixes for fast path, but in general, they're not showstopper fixes, they're just little fixes. So MikroTik is showing that they can add these big features into the main code train, and that we don't have to wait for version 7 for them.
Yeah, I think.
I was just gonna say it's you know, looking here at 641 RC3, there's at least 20 fixes mentioned.
Yeah.
Now you go back to version 5.26, there was 3. Sorry, 4. No, there's 4 combined in 26 and 25. Because they're getting much more verbose.
There's probably 40 in there, Mike, but no one knew about them apart from the developers.
So, yeah, it was mentioned at one point that, well, so much changes that we can't include everything in there. Well, I think enough people, like you're saying, Andrew, enough people kind of, hey, we want to know what's going on, because if we start running into problems, if we have no information on what happened, we can't troubleshoot it without calling MikroTik or emailing MikroTik and said, hey, it's broken, and then MikroTik comes back and says, yeah, we changed this. Well, it'd been nice to know.
That's right. There was a lot of that happening. I can recall in that 5.x release train, we'd upgrade routers to fix, I don't know, a PoE out issue, for example, in the RB750 UP, and it would say it would be fixed in the change log, and we'd upgrade it, and nothing else had apparently changed, and then SNMP would break and stuff like that. Whereas they don't seem to be doing that so much anymore. So it's really good. Router OS has actually been very stable, as long as you stick within the bug fix release train, for probably 18 months now, in my opinion. We don't see the random.
Tom's not here. Tom would severely disagree.
No, for me personally, there have still been some issues with OSPF, and specifically with multi-area OSPF setups that have been happening for the last at least half year. That just aren't being fixed. But I would imagine it's because MikroTik's priorities currently are not on the routing side of things. Probably because of, again, the supposed work on routing that's going on for the next major release. But we'll see how that goes. I mean, there have been like random breakings of random minor things. As always, it seems that just about every release MikroTik does, there is something broken or something changed within SNMP. While of course other things get fixed. But yes, on the general big picture things, it's been going pretty well lately.
I think so too. I'd love to see SNMP support become a first-class citizen, though. So whenever they introduce a new feature into Router OS, that it straight away has SNMP support. So it would be really nice to see, because unfortunately people still need to use SNMP for NMSs and the likes. So not having the ability to, I guess, see the state of the BGPPF, for example, that's a bit of a painful one for us, and dump things like the LLDP neighbors out of it and so on. I know you can do that now, but for a while there they didn't have that ability. Really
no, I mean, I think if we wanted to, we really could complain a lot about, everything that MikroTik still doesn't do and everything that's broken. And it's not just about MikroTik. Any vendor and every single vendor you go to, you will find things that you think should be there and should be fixed and are not. But I think MikroTik has done a fairly good job recently of balancing, new feature development and fixes and maintaining existing things. And it always has to be a balance, right? So overall, I think we are good. As I said, we could find many things that still need to be fixed, but they are being fixed. That's good. Every changelog, like we mentioned, has many things that are worked on. So
That's right. And like the recent addition, I don't know if you guys talked about this. I don't recall it, about the NV2 sync feature. I was extremely surprised to see that one drop in there. It seemed like quite a major development as far as RouterOS's wireless is concerned. But there hasn't actually been that much fanfare about it. I'm not sure if people just have given up on MikroTik wireless outdoors, or if it's just working for them. But I haven't seen much talk about it.
Actually, there's still our entire infrastructure is fully MikroTik wireless, but about a year and some ago, we migrated all of our NV2 to actually just plain .11, simply because plain .11 has much better performance and is much more stable than NV2. So I personally, and I've actually talked at MUMS with people, and I think internally in our chats, we also mentioned that NV2 has not really been developed for multiple years now. I think if you look at the changelogs, the last mention of NV2 development was 2 or even 3 years ago. And since .11 standard wireless has been constantly improved and implemented with new chipsets, with new standards, etc., it has reached a point where we can easily get, probably even 40 to 50% better performance with .11 than with NV2. And so it was actually a big surprise to me to find out that there even was some development on NV2 in the recent release. And I think that's why a lot of people are not even trying this out, or don't even know that there is such a thing in RouterOS, because from my experience at least, everybody that I know that still runs MikroTik wireless has simply migrated from NV2 to .11 as we have. So it's interesting, but I don't think it's going to make enough of a difference or enough of an actual performance or stability change that it will actually motivate people to migrate from .11 back to NV2. So I would really like to know where MikroTik is planning to go with NV2, if there will be, again, some development on NV2, if there will be, again, a reason to even run NV2 over .11 in the current state. So we'll just have to see what the future brings.
Well, and I think there's a big difference between point to multi-point and point to point as well. I have a lot of people running NV2 on backhaul links because they're not happy with the stability issues of, say, Mimosa, or some of the air fibers and things like that. So they're running MikroTik router boards with NV2 and getting fairly decent performance out of them, and they're stable. The hardware is stable, not necessarily that it's, hey, the software is much more feature packed. It's that the hardware is stable. They don't have to worry about negotiation issues and things like that. And I'm seeing, just like you, Tomas, the point to multi-point people are doing 802.11. The ones who are doing or were doing NV2 or InStream, they've kind of migrated away from it, or they're going to 802.11 to prepare for an upgrade to, say, ePMP Elevate, or, some other platform.
So the big features that were added in that NV2 feature dump recently were, what do you call it, downlink ratios. So you can specify of the bandwidth to the client how much or what percentage of it is downlink versus uplink. So that's a feature that has been in other products for, it seems like, forever now, but MikroTik were a bit slow. Previously, the feature effectively was there. It was just 50% uplink, 50% downlink, whereas now you can change that ratio. A lot of the guys on Emacs and other platforms set that to like 80-20 and things like that. So 80% downlink, 20% uplink. That's one of the big features that's useful in a multi-point environment. And the other one was the NV2 sync. I'm not sure how much that's been talked about, but effectively what that does is, if you've got a bunch of MikroTik APs that are running NV2, either on the same tower or on towers that can see each other, NV2 will send out I think it's an extra datagram or something inside the protocol that is a sync packet, and then the other APs can hear that. And as long as they've got the right magic secret key, they will start synchronizing the frames with each other. So if there are overlapping channels, it will effectively synchronize the transmit frames so that they all get a fair share. I thought that was a pretty funky feature. The other vendors seem to use GPS to do a similar thing.
Yeah, without a real I don't know why I'm looking without a real clock source. It makes me wonder how well it works. I mean, the reason you have GPS sync is that clock is on target for everybody.
Yes, it made me wonder too.
I think Ubiquity learned a very expensive in many forms, reputation, financially, so on, a very expensive lesson in straying from what everybody else does in terms of sync. Their AirMax sync was totally different than any other sync that anybody had, and it did not meet people's expectations, and so people didn't use it. And not to mention that it took them forever to get it to work halfway properly, and still consume double the airtime of not using sync. So seeing Microtik go down the path of doing something that nobody else does is very risky. Even if it works, people still may not adopt it because it's not what they're used to.
Yeah, there's a lot of weight behind the, I guess the terminology GPS sync. People think that it's the magic bullet that's going to solve all their problems, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But they certainly are familiar with the term and think it's going to.
And I think, like, when even today with Ubiquity having a seemingly functioning GPS sync in their new AirMax AC platform, people still assume it doesn't work because of the old one wasn't what they expected, so they assume the new one's just as bad. And I mean, I guess to their, people's credit, the people that, or the platforms that use GPS sync in the WISP world work very well. So it's difficult to say they're stupid because it works reliably.
Who knows where Microtik are heading with this? I mean, they're not exactly coming out and telling us. Maybe they will at the next Microtik user meeting. I'm not sure, but maybe this is just a test feature, and in the future they might integrate GPS with it. Who's to know? We can't read their minds, but it's certainly got the groundwork there that they could potentially add GPS to it later. And I noticed some of their newer AP products like the M43 have rather large headers on them. Who knows what they're for? Could be GPS, could be nothing. But one can hope.
I'll take this opportunity to formally invite someone from Microtik to come on and tell us exactly what their plans are with this.
I mean, if we are talking about wireless, I still think a lot of this, how a platform behaves come to how you configure it. And we all know that with vendors like Ubiquity, when there is 3 or 4 buttons that you can either turn on or off, there is not much you can do with it. Whereas the other side of the coin is the Microtik world, right? Where you have so many buttons and so many turnables and so many things to configure that, for example, for me, I am fairly certain that I could actually configure Microtik to behave better in just about any environment, whether it has GPS sync or not. But that is because I actually properly utilize all of the tools that there are in router, whereas in wireless, there are so many. And we all know, like, for example, Tom really likes to complain about the wireless settings menu and how it is laid out and things that are there, which is valid complaint. But at the same time, it gives you all of those options, and it gives you all of those tunable things which the other vendors don't have. So it's another thing of a balance, or of a different design philosophy and different user target market. Where with MikroTik, maybe it doesn't have like the magical auto GPS sync feature that others have, but on the other side, MikroTik has so many things which you can, of course, manually, but you can configure that if you do it right, you can make it behave much better, at the expense of the experience and the knowledge you need to have, at the expense of the time you need to take to tune all of those settings, etc. So, and I think that's been the MikroTik philosophy so far. Same with the switch chip and the switch chip menu on the existing CRS. There is so many things you can do with the CRS switch chip. It's magical because it gives you the full access to the switch API. Basically, it's you can change the VLAN learning modes. You can do all kinds of crazy rewriting of VLAN headers and everything else. You can tune in VLAN filtering and learning. You have access to SLV and ILV, IVL, SVL and IVL modes and everything else, right? Which just about no other vendor gives you. But again, at the downside of the massive hurdle of configuring it all and knowing what every single option and feature does. So like with the new switch chip menu, which is much simpler and much easier to configure, it still isn't like 2 buttons to do everything, but it's much more accessible. We'll see how and where MikroTik goes with this, if this is a philosophy they want to adopt into other areas of router OS or not. It just depends. But yeah, we'll just have to see.
When I'm teaching people or showing them MikroTiks and Router OS, I usually say that on MikroTiks there's 10 ways to do anything, and 8 of them are probably wrong. So it's one of the things I love about the MikroTiks is the flexibility and the fact that they do expose everything. But sometimes it doesn't always work out. Like switch settings, it's just too complicated to get basic setups up and running, and they're addressing that now.
Yeah, I think it's always a balance, right? Same with the development, how many new features and how many fixes you want to have. Same with this, how much complexity versus how much flexibility you want to give people, and etc. How complex the product is versus how well it can be tuned. So we'll see where MikroTik goes into the future, in between these two extremes even. Because if you compare, for example, Ubiquiti wireless and MikroTik wireless, I really think it's extreme differences in design principles, in target market, and in everything else, right? So we'll see. And yeah, this was just to the hardware thing, that having GPS sync doesn't mean the wireless is bad, and of course having GPS sync doesn't mean the wireless is good. So there is a lot more into this entire debate than just having some hardware or just having some software, and it's never a simple thing.
No, yeah, I was really surprised, as we talked about, surprised to see that feature come in the NV2 one, because as Thomas was saying, there were just no NV2 features in there for 3 or 4 years. The other one that people have absolutely been screaming out for was the spectral scan on 802.11 AC radios, which other vendors appear to have somehow done or implemented, but MikroTik haven't implemented it, and they recently said that they were not going to be able to do it easily purely because they don't use the mainstream Atheros driver. They've actually written their drivers from what it seems like as scratch, so they can't reuse that spectral scan code from upstream. They'd have to write something from scratch, and at this time it seems to be too big of an undertaking for them. And yeah, at least they're honest, which is good to hear, even if everybody is screaming for the feature.
And you look at companies like MikroTik, I can't imagine the amount of stuff that they have to sift through to get to who wants what feature and who's calling for what feature and how many of them, because not only have the people who have absolutely no clue, I've seen some of the requests for some of these manufacturers, from a wireless manufacturer that just did access points. One of the feature requests was, I want your product to do BGP. And it's like, okay, and they would get thousands of requests a week, and 20% of them were just that off base that you're making a wireless access point, and one guy wants BGP, another one wants it to to be able to monitor his entire network.
So then I guess to make it easier for manufacturers, I'll do another formal invitation. Any manufacturer that wants to know what they should do, just ask us and we will tell you. And it's just all you have to put into it. Just ask us. We'll decide for you.
Well, what Justin was saying before, I got the distinct impression there was a lot of screaming from people for MSTP on RouterOS, but I'm not sure that people actually understood what they were asking for and what its use cases were. And I know when I first came across MSTP, I was all excited by it, thinking it was going to solve all my problems, until I realized that it wasn't. And what I actually needed was per VLAN spanning tree, which RouterOS already has. So yeah, it'll be, and even from people on the forums already have been trying to use it and having issues with it because it works like it should, but it doesn't work like they thought it should.
Actually, that's the thing, right? With RouterOS current implementation of spanning tree, it's it's very easy to do things you shouldn't, like introduce spanning tree into VLANs, which you should not do. Of course you can. It can do, yeah, in that way you can do per VLAN spanning tree and things like this, but this is not per standard. And actually, with the current implementation, of course, you can't actually do some things which should be doable. And it's the same thing with introducing LLDP frames into VLANs, because that's the same mechanism through which you would do per VLAN spanning tree, that you would introduce spanning tree BPDUs into individual VLANs through the bridge configuration, right? But that's not what you are supposed to do. Same with LLDP, same with even like MikroTik neighbor discovery, same with Roamon and blah, blah, blah. So I think we are missing in MikroTik, well, again, it's two sides of the coin, right? Because there is no difference between logical and physical interfaces and between VLANs and hardware ports and tunnels even, right? You can introduce specific frames into those which should not be there normally, but maybe you want to have them there, etc. And, it creates just an unregulated, unstandardized, I would say, mess that, yes, sure, in certain situations it can be beneficial, but most of the time people won't know what they are doing realistically and will do things which they shouldn't. So I think specifically for spanning tree, it's really good that they finally now are properly integrating it, the difference between a logical port and a physical port, and what and how and where should go and shouldn't. I think that's actually really healthy for just people messing with stuff they don't know and just turning on spanning tree and that's it. And even worse, I've seen some crazy things done where in recent RouterOS versions, I think in like last year plus, spanning tree has been automatically enabled by default on every new bridge. And of course the priority for spanning tree is 8K in hex, which is the default priority for every single vendor. So we just create a new bridge which has spanning tree enabled, and it's entirely possible that you will take a root bridge for your entire topology while introducing spanning tree BPDUs into VLANs and crazy stuff like that, which and yeah, if you really know what you are doing, it's useful, but realistically most of the time it's actually unhealthy for the network to do things like this. So
I find that feature,
sorry?
I find that ability to turn spanning tree off and on an individual bridge, so effectively having per VLAN spanning tree, I actually really like that feature on RouterOS. So I know they removed that in one of their earlier releases of the new switch code. Hopefully they don't remove it, because I quite like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you know what you are doing, it's really nice. But on the other side, imagine a situation where, for example, into wireless interfaces, you have the ability to tag frames for certain SSIDs or virtual access point or physical wireless cards natively now. And you can put those into a bridge and it's natively tagged, but RouterOS doesn't know about that. And so immediately you actually expose, spanning tree BPDUs into a VLAN, which you now have no way of controlling that those spanning tree BPDUs should go on the physical interface rather than into the VLAN. And I think it's like inconsistencies like this that I really hope will be eliminated by the new bridging configuration. I'm not saying take away the possibility to do crazy things if you want to. And MikroTik has said that they will keep that. You will still be able to like add logical interfaces into a bridge directly and do things like this. But I think from default, at least in the default configuration where people who don't know what they are doing and just create a bridge and add a bunch of ports and add a bunch of VLANs and other things, it should not behave in a non-standard way.
Yeah, I see that quite a bit. You know, I'll see someone add an IP address to an interface that's in a bridge, and that's supposed to be a no-no, but it works, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work. And so, you know, explaining to somebody, hey, you shouldn't have done this in the first place. Well, it's worked all along. And so from, you know, coming in and trying to help them fix their network, it's like, well, it's worked, so, you know, who the heck are you? You know, you don't know what you're talking about because this has worked. So it should be a, hey, this is an absolute. It either works or it doesn't work.
Yeah, the common one I get is people having
I think we lost Thrift.
Yeah, it seems so.
Apparently the cables on the Pacific have gone down.
Ah, there he is. I see him moving now.
That I bet you can't wait for that new can't be sure how to pronounce it, Hawaii key cable, can't you?
Oh yeah, cheaper bandwidth. Always keen for that. Yeah, what I was saying, guys, is it's really common that I'll have customers call me up and having connectivity issues on their bridge network or something they've done with bridges and it's intermittent and they can't put a finger on it, and they go in there and see spanning trees enabled on all their bridges because it is by default, and that's the cause of it, getting route election problems and topology changes on the rest of their network that are actually causing the problems on their MikroTik devices. Well, connectivity problems, and I just generally go in there and disable spanning tree on the bridges and everything's magically fixed. So I'm not sure when they turn that on by default, if it's always been that way, or Thomas mentioned it might have come in recently.
Yeah, it was changed about a year ago. Previously, the default bridge RSTP mode or STP mode was none, and they changed it for all new bridges from certain 6 point something release to be RSTP.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think it's a problem itself having spanning tree turned on by default. It just needs to behave per standard and consistently, which currently doesn't because of the things that we discussed, because of the no concept of virtual versus tunnel versus physical interface for spanning tree purposes. Of course, for other purposes, it's really nice that every single interface is completely the same and completely on the same level in RouterOS. That's lovely. But for other protocols like LLDP, which should not ever be inside of a VLAN, you know, there are certain things which you want to do and certain things which should not be done. And currently, RouterOS can very easily, by default, by a person who doesn't know what they are doing, you know, be made not do things which are good. And again, it's the debate of flexibility versus configurability versus you know, the barrier of entry into a product line. It's not a simple discussion. It's not a simple thing that this should be done to fix these problems, right? It's very complex debates and very complex issues.
So, I mean, a couple of times now I've been in meetings with customers or talking to people about MikroTik and what they use on their network and so on. And I've actually had several people say, "Oh, MikroTik's banned from our network." And I'm like, "Banned? Why is it banned?" And as you dig a bit deeper, you find out that they've not understood what they're trying to implement, and they've done something and it's caused issues on their network. But it's not actually MikroTik's fault, or it could be any vendor actually. They could be blaming Juniper or anybody, but
put any tool in the hand of an idiot, it's not going to work.
Exactly right. That's my opinion on that one, Mike.
Oh yeah, it's why actually, you know, and you will see even my points on this are conflicting, because for example, I love the MikroTik wireless interface. I actually like it being so complex and having so many options and being able to do whatever, but I completely understand how for some people that's not the right approach. So I completely understand how you actually like, you know, the per VLAN or per bridge spanning tree and all of that. But for me, for example, that's not something that I think should be done. So that's why I said this is not a simple debate. This is not a simple of this is the way to fix it. It's a very complex problem.
Can you imagine how difficult it is for the programmers at MikroTik working out how to implement these things? They'll be having that debate all of the time.
Oh, and we actually haven't mentioned this, guys. Yes, I think people that listen to us for a long time know, but MikroTik has a very small development team. It's not like they have hundreds of developers at their hands, right? I think the last that we heard, MikroTik has somewhere around 50 developers, and that's really it. And this has actually, from what I know at least, this has actually been increased like this just recently. Even like 3 years ago, the entire core development team of RouterOS was less than 20 people. So this is a very small, very in-house team that's all located in one place in Riga. It's all Latvians, right? So it's not like they have, you know, 1,000 man hours per week to spend on developing and testing and playing and preparing like experimental features that will never see the light of day like other vendors do, simply because they don't have that much manpower and they choose to keep their development team and their development strategy the way they do, which of course translates into MikroTik being very cost effective and very cheap equipment. And yeah, it's just very complex, you know, debates. And yeah, I don't think there was a point anywhere in the last minute, but anyway.
That was good information anyway, Thomas. But I think you're right, and it's clear. I mean, I use multiple different vendors' products, and you can see sometimes, even on Cisco's iOS XE, which features have been developed by one team and which features have been developed by another, by the way that they do their logging and you do the debug might be different. And RouterOS is the same. I'll give an example. Logging for most things is really excellent. You can turn on OSPF logging and OSPF debug packet and that sort of thing. You can see the raw packets. But if you want to see your LDP neighbors come up in MPLS, for example, you turn that on in logging, the feature's there, but you get no logs. So it's clear that some features are developed by one team or one developer and other features are developed by another one, and they don't always have the same sort of result. Or in Winbox, you quite often see user interface differences between features. So for example, between Roamon and Neighbor Discovery, the user interfaces are very different. The Roamon one's actually pretty nice, I have to say. The ability to enable and disable globally or per interface is really good, whereas with Neighbor Discovery, it's either done on, or only done on a per interface basis. You can't have an all matcher, you can't have an all decline and then enable on a per interface basis. And it all comes down to development teams and the size of the teams and who works on what. Yeah. We lost Thomas.
Yeah, oh. I think he dropped off.
No, I'm here. I was just plugging in my laptop to power. Battery running out.
Sorry, I was just joking about your Slovakian power.
Oh, don't even get me started. Oh man.
I was just saying that
I could complain about that for the next half.
I was just saying how with MikroTik and other vendors, you see differences between the way features are implemented from one feature to another. Just particularly in the logging, say between OSPF's excellent, LDP's not so much. In fact, it doesn't log at all. Yeah. kind of ties into what you were saying before about the size of the development teams, Thomas.
And I mean, I don't know, of course, much about how MikroTik does development internally, but if you think about RouterOS as a software product, right? It's a software code base that has been developed, that has been maintained, and that has progressed for over, somebody correct me, but I think it's been almost 15 years, right? So if you think about how development, well, I guess most of our listener base doesn't know much about software development, but software development approaches and software development philosophies have changed a lot, like diametrally changed in the last just 10 years. Less even speaking about 15 or more that RouterOS has been around, right? These days you have agile development, you have test-driven development, you have XD, which is extreme development practices, etc. It's very common for everything to be like automated build processes, continuous delivery, and all of these things that have happened in the software development world. And these are not simple shifts for development teams that are very small and that have been around for a very long time. So if you think about how RouterOS was developed, say, 15 or 10 years ago, and if you think that most of the core development team on the MikroTik RouterOS is still there and it's the same people that were there simply because they are so small and simply because the talent in Latvia is so limited, and specifically programmers for embedded networking devices is a very limited market for developers. And so I guess what I'm just trying to say is that it's developing software, and specifically one as complex as RouterOS is no easy task, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And for a very small team like MikroTik, it's just things take time. You know, some things are not good, like no logging in VPLS at all, right? But there are other priorities, and sometimes you have to write things from scratch because your vendor drops support, like IPsec issues with Tylera, right? And it's it's, I can imagine like the internal debates at MikroTik on how they should do things and how they should not, what they should implement and what they should not, what they should fix, and how to prioritize things and how to plan their development cycles. It's very complex issues, very complex things, and I don't know where I'm going with this either, so feel free to jump in.
It's amazing to see the progress they have made considering the size of development teams and I guess where they are in the world. It's a pretty impressive product.
Yeah, I mean, we all have our ideas of what should be done and of what should be implemented and what should be fixed and how, but yeah, it's
balancing act.
Yes.
Well, we seem to have not 4 seconds now. We run out of things to say. Oh, relevant things to say.
So, does anybody have any more interesting topics to discuss for today?
I will note that the intent of the cast was to go over the new chips that MikroTik is using in their switches and the bridging interfaces and related discussion. And we've probably spent half the cast talking about wireless and user interfaces and just basic development. as usual.
Well, I think a lot of the chipset stuff, people are, they're going to go want to read it. They want to hear somebody, talk a little bit about it, but there's so many acronyms, so many, 802 dot whatevers that people are going to go want to talk to it, or they're going to go want to go read it and digest it a little.
Figure out how they can use it in their network.
Yeah, and figure out what it is. I mean, unless you're in the carrier world, you're not going to know what an NNI is on carrier Ethernet, or you're not going to be able to apply that to your scenario or your customers. But if you've heard us mention that it's supported, go read about it and ask MikroTik about it. Hey, are you going to support this? Because this looks like something that would be really cool that I could implement to my customers.
That's right, and hopefully people do go back to MikroTik and tell them what features they want, because as we mentioned, that development process is very complex, and unless people are telling them what features they want, then they don't know. So by all means, email support@mikrotik.com and tell them, or talk to them at the mums.
And I think there's still a thread going on for features and things like that on their forums.
Oh, there definitely is. If you've got specific ones, though, I find emailing them's generally better.
Oh. Did we lose those cables again? Oh, no, he's moving. Okay. Cool. We lost you for about 5 or 10 seconds. But, alrighty, well. Nobody has anything else to say, it sounds like.
No, you guys are dropping in and out with Thomas's anyway, so connectivity's not so great around the world.
We've used up enough bandwidth around the world for the day.
Did we go over everything that you wanted to talk about in your notes there, Andrew?
Yeah, I think pretty much. A lot of it's up in the air at the moment, obviously, because we don't know what MikroTik are thinking. But certainly some pretty cool stuff on the actual hardware. So it'll be really good to see over the next probably 12 months, I guess, what MikroTik are going to implement and what they don't, and see how we can use it in our networks and how it allows us to make more money and do more fun things.
All right, and I suppose with that, we'll wrap it up. Almost everyone I ever share, I forget what Greg always does at the end, and kind of wrap things up as far as what people are going to be working on coming up. What's interesting. So I guess we'll just go across the screen. Andrew, what do you got going on?
Work-wise, I've got a whole bunch of Juniper MX routers that I'm attempting to configure to talk to each other at the moment and talk to MikroTiks and that sort of thing. So that's keeping me pretty busy during the week. Outside of that, work life, kids, keeps you pretty busy. The other thing is, if people want to get in contact with me, I'm on Facebook on most of the WISP groups, or you can ping me a direct message on there if you want to ask any questions. Also on the MikroTik forums quite a bit, so if you ask anything about MPLS or switching, I'll probably pop my head in there and give my opinion.
All right. Justin, what do you got going on?
Biggest thing I'm working on is trying to get the book out the door. So
okay.
lots and lots of writing, lots and lots of words.
Fun. And Thomas, in the Unimus 1.0 world, now that everything's done, what are you doing now?
Yeah, so I've actually been also writing a lot of words this week. I finally had a good week where I could focus on coding again. So I actually took it upon myself, since everything is done, since 1.0 was released, I took it upon myself to rewrite the core of Unimus. Because the way, anyway, it's just some internal code issues to make it much easier to add things into the future and to support more new vendors and more new features. So at the start of this week, I decided that, yeah, let's rewrite the core, and I've been fixing that and rewriting that for the entire week, and I'm almost finally ready to have it done. Basically, we have a lot of tests internally in Unimus currently just for the core of Unimus, which I'm rewriting. There is about 220 tests. We run tests across all of our supported vendors for discovery working, backup working, blah blah blah. Anyway, when I finished rewriting the core, about 90 of the 220 tests were broken. So you can see just how great of a coder I am. No, that's a joke. So yeah, for the half of the week I've been rewriting the core, and since the Thursday I've been fixing everything that I broke, and we are hoping to release 1.1 of Unimus sometimes in the hopefully in early September, with a whole lot of new features and with the rewritten core, which will now do many new nice things. So yeah, I've been rambling on long enough now. So yeah, just finally a good week to code. That nothing else got broken, no power outages that needed to be taken care of, and things like that. So it's been nice to focus on one thing finally, and then actually stay on one thing for an entire week.
Yeah, I don't have too much going on. I've got probably 3 or 4 different wireless expansions for the Wisp. Probably 2 or 3 fiber expansions that I'm trying to get people nailed down for, and then getting some things wrapped up, migrations, upgrades in both Indianapolis and St. Louis for the IX, and yeah, so not much. Alrighty, well, I guess thank you, Thrift, for your time and all the information, and see you guys, I guess, next week's our next regularly scheduled one. So I guess we'll see all you guys later.
Thanks, guys, for having me on.
Catch you guys later.